Great. Well, thank you so much, Bailey. Hey, everybody. I'm Molly. I'm a product designer in Denver, Colorado, and I've been specializing in Figma design systems for the past few years. And in addition to working with teams, I created UI Prep and recently launched a course called Design System Bootcamp, where I get to teach other designers how to build their own systems, which is a ton of fun. And one thing that comes up a lot when I'm teaching is the idea that design systems in Figma are really an internal product, and the designers on your team are their users. And this is just as true for an enterprise level team as it is for a team of one. So, just like when we're designing any other product, we need to focus on the user experience. So, in this talk, I'm going to go over 6 ways you can make your design system a better experience for your designers. So, my tips are to have a flexible file structure, be a style minimalist, make components discoverable, make component changes obvious, simplify with subcomponents, and then lastly, keep your file tidy. So let's dive in with the first one. Have a flexible file structure. So there's a lot of ways to set up and organize your files in Figma, and they all have their own pros and cons, but let's take a look at a few quick examples. So first we have the basic system, where components, icons, and styles and designs all live inside of one Figma file. And this can be great for small, nimble teams, but there's really not much room to grow or evolve. And then next, we have the simple system, where all components, icons, and styles live in one file that's published as a team library. And then all design work lives in one or multiple other files. And this can also be great for small teams. There is more room to grow, but there's still not much room to evolve your system. Which brings me to the last structure, a dynamic system, where components, icons, and styles are split up into multiple files, which are all published as team libraries. And then all design work lives in multiple other files. And this is what I recommend for most teams because there's unlimited room to grow and evolve. And with a structure like this, you can support multiple themes, product areas, operating systems, so on and so forth, because it allows designers to cherry pick the exact parts of a system they need for any given file, rather than being forced to choose between all or nothing. Let's go over a quick example of how a system like this might evolve. So let's say you have a team with both a web app and a marketing site. And both products share libraries sitting at the top of the design system tree. They can share the style library as well as the icon library to maintain consistent branding. However, they both need very different components, so it doesn't make sense for them to share a component library. So instead, what they can do is they can each have their own dedicated component library and only give their design files access to the component library they need. So for example, when a designer is working on the marketing site, they can access all the global styles and icons in addition to the marketing specific components they need without having to sift through all the components for the web app over here. And the same structure can be used for a product supporting multiple systems like iOS and Android, or maybe a front and back facing UI. Sort of like how Uber has one side for the rider and the other side for the driver. So it might look like more work because you have more files, but it really isn't. You're still building out all the same things in a dynamic system, but their separation gives designers access to only the things they need and none of the things they don't, reducing the number of decisions that designers have to make each day. And I highly recommend this file structure for almost every team, as it really does ensure good user experience for your designers long term, no matter how your system evolves. All right, so next, let's go over how to be a style minimalist. So one of the easiest mistakes to make in a design system is having too many colors. Almost every color palette generator is going to suggest, 15 plus colors, each with 10 tints and shades, usually 100 through 1,000. And adding all of these to your system can easily lead to chaos because you have more than you need, and it gets really hard to remember when to use which color, which is really draining for designers to have to remember and usually leads to misuse. So instead, try saving the smallest number of color styles as possible, each one with a really clear purpose that's currently needed, not needed one day, but needed right now for the product. And for a lot of teams, that looks like having a neutral, primary, secondary, success, warning, and danger color. But don't feel like you need to add all these colors just because your system should have them. If your product doesn't need a secondary color or maybe a warning color, you can just skip them and they can always add them in later once they are needed. And once you have the right colors, not only documented but saved to your file as a style, you can add a description to the save style, and not only will it show up as a tooltip, but it'll also be searchable. Let's give that a quick try. If I have this object and I want to add a style for the fill, you can see that every single style is going to have a little tooltip explaining what the primary purpose of that style is. So it makes it really, really easy to remember and know which color to use when. Alternatively, you can also search for keywords, which are your description. So something like default, or even something more specific like a line, if you add that note to your neutral color. And this is going to be a lifesaver for you or someone else on your team who's trying to remember, which exact neutral color to use for the division line. All right, and don't feel too bad for the colors we skipped. Just because they didn't make the cut for being a style doesn't mean we need to lose them forever. I recommend keeping them around in the form of a color key. Here you can track the bigger picture, all the colors you're using, as well as all the colors you aren't. And this provides a really rich context for where all your colors came from and is a source for where to find new ones as they're needed in the future. So we can see here we have the original 10 tints and shades for each color. And the ones that have been saved are marked with a little check mark here. So being a color minimalist and only saving the colors that you absolutely need is definitely going to help your designers work faster and reduce inconsistencies in their products. And this is really important to establish early on, as it gets harder and harder to remove colors over time because it becomes unclear, which ones are being used, which ones aren't. And so it's better to start small in the beginning and then add more as you go. Next, let's take a look at how to make a component discoverable. So we're going to look here first at an example of a button that's not doing that. So now that we have variants and properties, it can be tempting to build out a sort of mega component that can do it all. For example, a really massive set of buttons that can be transformed into multiple different types of buttons, like regular, icon, and link, by configuring the different properties. And while it is a little satisfying to be able to make something like this work, it actually makes discovering your components a lot harder for designers. So using this button as an example, I'm going to open up the assets panel. When someone's looking for, when someone's looking at the assets panel and there is no link button, they have to just already know and also remember that in order to get a link button, they need to add in a component from the asset panel that has a generic name, like this one, just button, and looks different. This one's filled in. And then use the properties to create that link. So I'm gonna add this in. And now I'm gonna use my properties over here to change this from a regular button to a link button. And this is a pretty poor experience. Components should be much easier to find and not rely on the designer's memory. So instead, you should separate components into smaller sets. So let's look at another example. And when deciding how to split these components up, I like to always ask the question, what should a designer see when looking in the assets panel? And then work backwards from there. almost always separating components by their type or purpose is going to be really helpful. So let's start with this example, our button, and look in the assets panel. We have our good button. We see it's broken up by each individual type. So we already know just by looking what is currently available to us. And we even could, if we want to go a step further and separate these out by primary, secondary, danger, and so on, just to make it even more obvious all of the options available right away to any designer. Let's check out a few other examples. Let's start with our badge. So we see here a few different types of badges. We have our label, status, icon, and notification. And these are nearly identical. It would be really easy to combine them as one or two sets of components, but they do serve very different purposes, so it's better to keep them separate. Let's take a look at our badges here. Great, just by looking in the assets panel, we already have a really clear understanding of what's available to us, even if we're brand new to this file. We can add in any of these components. Let's take a look at one last example, the input. So again, we have all these different types of inputs, a flexible input, single select, multi-select, date, password, etc. And again, they're all using almost the same structure. So it'd be really easy to combine them with our properties, but then we couldn't see them in the assets panel. So we get this really nice experience where we can just preview all these little thumbnails of the different options available to us. And not only do we not have to remember what we have, but also when we drag in our component, we already have the component we want, and we don't have this extra task of going over here to the properties panel and configuring the component to what we want it to be. So separating components to make them more discoverable is going to make finding the right one a lot easier and faster for your designers. And it's also going to ensure that components aren't forgotten about by the team. And if you're on an enterprise team, you can also track your component usage a lot more accurately. All right, now let's go over how to make the available changes to a component obvious for the designers. So rather than having a designer guess what can or should be changed in a component, and then digging into the layers to make that change, we can use properties to bring all those possible and suggested changes to the surface. So let's take a look at a few different examples for that. We'll start with the badge again. So I'm going to add an instance of our badge. And we can see that all the changes that we can make to this badge are listed right over here. And some of them are variants, the different versions that we can see over here, the different sizes, colors, contrast levels. And some of them are other properties, like our Boolean on and off switch for the icon and the text label over here. Then we also have the instance swap property that is conditional. So only once an icon is turned on can we see the option to swap an icon. So I'm going to turn on the left icon. And now that that icon is showing, I can now choose to swap it with a different one. And so having a lot of properties like this badge implies a lot of flexibility with the component. These badges can be used in a lot of different ways, while having very few properties implies a less flexible component, like the status badge over here. We can add in an instance of our status badge. And let's get a closer look. This component is actually quite rigid. There's no way to edit the icon or the text. And this is intentional. It's meant to be really consistent in the designs, always showing the same text and icon. And it's really clear to any designer that they shouldn't make those changes because they're just simply not available over here. So we can pick up on those cues from the design system on how to use our components. Now let's take a look at two other components that take their properties to the next level. Let's take a look at our buttons one more time. So the button component uses a instance swap property for each of its icons. And while it's possible to swap in any icon, only a handful are used commonly. So these icons can be saved as preferred icons, giving them sort of like a VIP status. And this means that when you go to swap the icon, you can see a little short list of the VIPs for faster editing. So while there are about 100 icons in the system, we only see the 5 preferred ones. Let's give it a quick test. I'm going to add in an instance of this button. And I'll add an icon. Now that I see the icon, I can swap what it is. Instead of seeing 100 icons here, I just see this short preferred list of my 5 most common icons used with buttons. Although I can, of course, always go into this dropdown and use any of the local components. Last, let's take a look at the dropdown component. So this component includes nested instances that are exposed. And this feature is still in beta, but you should definitely get it. It just takes a second to change in your settings, and it's a total game changer. What's really amazing about this feature is that in addition to editing properties that have been applied to your component, you can also edit the properties applied to the nested instances inside of it from the top level. So these individual rows down here are going to be editable when we simply select an instance of our dropdown. I'll give you an example. Add an instance. We can see here on this top level, I can control all of the properties that were applied to this component here. In this case, it's just a series of Boolean properties for each individual row. So I can add more if I need them. I can also take them away. Let's have just 3. And here's where it gets special. Here's where the nested instances are. Since I have 3 rows being exposed right now, I can also see down here those individual rows. These are the nested instances, and they're currently being exposed. So I can configure their properties from right here without having to click into the component over here. So I have these 3 rows, and let's give it a try. I'm going to add a left icon for each. And then also change which one's active. So I'll make the first one default and the second one active. Great. So as you can see, using properties really is game-changing, and it not only makes editing components easier, it also makes knowing which edits are obvious. Sorry, it also makes knowing which edits to make obvious, removing a lot of the guesswork for your designers, which is a much better experience. Next, let's go over how to simplify a component by using subcomponents. So subcomponents, which is a term I learned from Nathan Curtis, are a great way to simplify complex components. So instead of handing designers a fully formed component, you can give them all the parts they need to build their own fully formed component as they're designing. And this is a great way to turn a potentially over-engineered, hard-to-learn component into something that's both easier and more flexible. My favorite example is with the table. We can see here the table component is made up of a series of columns, which are available in the Assets panel. And the intention is for designers to pull in individual columns and construct their own tables, rather than having a fully built out, rather than configuring the fully built out table. So let's give this a quick try. I have my columns here. I'm going to go into the Assets panel. Right, drag in a column, the instance of the component over here. I'm going to create a few instances just by duplicating. And let's see, let's take a look. First thing we can do is configure some of those top level decisions here. So all of these columns can have a different number of rows, 10 or 20, a different style, maybe line or zebra, show or exclude a header. And they can also have different types. So they can all be badge, for example. So I'm going to go in and make these all a little bit unique. This first one, I'll make a checkbox. The last one, a more icon. see, I'll have one be a profile and another be status. Perfect. Now that we've done some configuring from the top level, we can have those nested instances, so we can go in and make some really detailed changes. Let's take this one row, for example, so this one column. First thing you can do is I can edit the header cell. Let's say I want it to be sorting. And then next I can go through and edit the status badge nested inside of each one of these data cells. This first one could be error, the second one complete, third one success, for example. Now to make this a table, I can place all these columns into one auto layout frame by pressing Shift A and having 0 pixels between the columns. Now I'm going to configure some of the auto layout settings for the children, so all the different columns inside. I'll keep the 2 columns with just icons set to a fixed width. I'm going to say that maybe I want this first column to be a little bit wider than the rest, so I'll keep it at a fixed width as well. And then I'll make the rest of them fill container. So you can see that we do some really easy editing. We have a really straightforward and responsive table, and it's really quite flexible. We can, for example, move the columns around, make any updates to them over here. Let's see, and I can also edit the sizes whenever I need to. So some columns can be fixed and some can be a little more fluid and fill the given space in the container. So to make this process even faster, you can also provide a shortcut, which is to create a template of your table. Over to layers. We can see that this template inside of the name has little instructions to detach it, because this is really just meant to be a starting point and not used as a full component. So I'm going to go in and detach this instance. But I see that inside, each one of the columns are still very much attached. And now I have the additional pagination in the bottom as well. It's just a nice little shortcut if you're going to have designers building tables quite a bit, to have them be able to add in this empty template very quickly and easily, where it already has maybe a common number of columns, this pagination, and the auto layout settings already set up for them. But they'll still have that flexibility of being able to change the column widths, the column order, how many columns there are, things like that. Let's head back up here. So as you can see, for more complex components like the table, taking a deconstructed approach and offering subcomponents to your designers can make something really complicated much easier, which will ultimately lead to better adoption by your team. Lastly, let's go over how to keep your file neat and tidy. So having a tidy file helps your designers find what they're looking for. It also helps ensure that components are being used and edited properly. So let's take a look at the tab components as an example. So the tab component uses a lot of smaller nested components, similar to the drop-down component with the individual rows. All these tabs have these individual tabs for all the different orientations and sizes, which is really helpful, but also clutters up the assets panel quite a bit. Open up the assets. We can see the tabs we want up here, and then all of this clutter down here. So to clean this up, we can hide all of the nested components, because we really don't want designers pulling in and using these little bits and pieces. We just want them using the full tab component. So to do this, we can add a dot or underscore at the beginning of any component name to make it private, meaning they'll be hidden from the asset panel, both in this file and in other files using this team library. But don't worry, they'll still appear inside of the larger component and work as intended. They just won't show up in the assets panel, which is perfect because they're not intended to be used on their own, and they just create a lot of clutter, which is making it harder to find the actual component that you're looking for. Let's give this a try. I'm going to select all of these smaller components. I'm going to rename them all in bulk by pressing Command R. And instead of having them all be named tab, I'm going to name them dot tab. Let's see if it worked. Head over to the assets panel. Perfect. Now under this tab section, I only have my 3 fully built out tabs and none of those smaller bits and pieces. So one thing to note, if your file is not published as a team library, the components won't hide. And if you don't plan to publish your file, you can also use additional folders to round up these little bits and pieces to make them less prominent. And to create these folders, you can place all the components inside of an additional frame. Let's take a look at the inputs as an example. See here, quite a big collection of smaller components that go into our inputs. So this frame here is doing 2 things. It's organizing all of these components into a folder that we can see in the assets panel. We take a look. We have all of our fully built out inputs, and then all those little bits and pieces are now tucked away in this little atom folder down here. And this folder is closed by default, which makes the section a lot easier to scan. It also makes the page a lot more organized. Even though this particular file is published as a team library, I still like to add the frame for really complex components that have a lot of these smaller atomic components, just for the page organization. And let's see. You notice the frame has a gray fill. This is actually something I do for all containers housing atomic components. So rather than the full component, let's take a look at the button group as a quick example. So the component sets for the individual buttons have a gray fill, while the full component has a white fill. And this shows a really clear hierarchy between the two, making the page and component structure much easier to understand, especially for anyone who's less familiar with this system. So keeping your assets panel and your pages neat and tidy makes them more scannable and helps designers find what they're looking for. Again, a much better experience for your designers and will lead to better, faster work. So those are my 6 tips for improving the user experience for a Figma design system. Having a flexible file structure with the dynamic system, being a style minimalist with as few colors as possible, making components discoverable by splitting them up by type and purpose, making component changes obvious with properties, simplifying with subcomponents for a more deconstructed approach, and keeping your file tidy with hidden components and clear hierarchy. And no matter your team size, these best practices are going to make using and scaling your Figma system a lot easier.
Wow, Molly, and I thought that I know a thing or two about Figma. That was a slightly different level. This was a bit unexpected, I have to say. Thank you so much for all your wonderful insights. You have no idea how many questions we have in the Fig Jam
Oh,
just
good.
now. So I think we have to go in. This is like a lot. So we have maybe like 5-7 minutes to go through a couple of questions, but we have
Oh,
so
sure.
many. I just pasted the link to you here in the chat. I don't know if you can see it.
Oh,
Maybe,
yes.
can you?
1 second. Let me open it up.
Yeah, so maybe you can actually keep sharing it, so we can see. I can guide you a little bit through the questions that came up.
Sure. Do you want me to share the screen with the questions?
Yeah, would it work,
Oh, great.
Amanda?
Yeah, let me
Yeah,
change what screen I'm sharing.
excellent. So I'll just go in just a moment. Thank you so much, everyone, for actually dropping in your questions. And so please take the moment to actually go through the questions and add hearts to questions that you find most relevant or most interesting or most important for you. There are indeed there's quite a few of those that I would like to bring up.
All
Right.
right. Oh, wow. Oh my gosh, so much is happening.
There is a lot of stuff happening, indeed. Yes.
All right, where
All
should we
right.
start?
Okay. Oh, that is just. Oh, wow. This is escalated now. So I think if you actually scroll a bit further down, there are quite a few. One on the
Down.
top, on the bottom. Oh, wow. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Even probably further down. Let's go. Maybe I can actually bring this up. One of them that got a lot of hearts, as you can see now. If you already have a full component library that is heavily adopted, this is like the one with the pink border. If you already have a
Mm.
full component library that is heavily adopted and you would like to use these new features, how do you recommend without breaking existing components? Hold on. How would
Mm.
you recommend doing so without breaking existing component instances and designs?
Yes, this is a great question and a tricky one, to be honest. There's some components where if you're just going to add maybe like a Boolean property here or there or a swap instance property, you might be able to just edit the existing component. If that's not the case, you need to do like more of a full restructure. What you can do is end up actually building out a brand new component using the newest properties. Hopefully, this is a component you plan to be using heavily in the future.
Mhm.
And start using that one. And you can use a lot of documentation to show that that one is the new one to be using going forward, and that the old one is now deprecated. And you can add to that old one inside of the name. It can say deprecated, so designers know not to keep adding it to their designs. You can also add documentation inside the design system, highlighting it that it shouldn't be used anymore. And once you feel like it's nearly extinct in your designs, you can even do something really obvious, like maybe add in like a big red sign inside of the component saying, deprecated, don't use,
Mhm.
delete this
Mhm.
component. And that'll be a really clear sign, something really easy to spot for designers to go in and actually swap out those two components.
Right. Right. Excellent. Well, we need you for a couple of hours more, I think. But one question that also got a lot of interest, how do you manage responsive or components with different breakpoints?
How do I manage responsive components with different breakpoints? I mean, auto layout kind of almost fully solved this, right? I would say if you have components that need to support different breakpoints, auto layout's going to take you 90% there a lot of the times,
Mhm.
handling how your design can scale from um, different breakpoints. And then obviously, if something's a little bit more dramatic, like a table, for example, might look quite different on mobile versus a full desktop, especially if it's a more complex table. So you might have to have two separate components in that instance.
Mhm.
But I would say a lot of them should fare pretty well with just auto layout and resizing.
Mhm. Okay. Well, another one that got a lot of attention is the green one. Have you tried to use slots for table cells instead of having the columns components?
Slots for table cells. So let's see. I haven't. I think I've thought about it. So slots are interesting because they're kind of a fun concept, but they're really just a placeholder item. They're really not much different than using, say, like a placeholder icon. And as you're designing, you just know, okay, this is clearly a placeholder. I'm going to replace it with an instance of something more intentional.
Hmm.
With a table, it's safe to say, at least for most tables, that the default version is probably going to be a just text or maybe a number, depending on what your team's working on. So starting off with something really common might actually just be faster and easier than starting off with a placeholder that's just blank. However, it wouldn't necessarily be wrong. It just might add an extra step a lot of the time.
Hmm. Okay. At this point, I also would like to thank everyone who has been not only asking questions in FigJam, but also replying or answering
Oh,
questions
great.
that came up, kind of adding links and things like that. So maybe, I don't know how much time we have left, maybe just maybe two more questions and also two quick answers. Maybe let's see how this goes.
Sure.
One
Rapid
question
fire.
that came up as well, how do you manage interactive components?
How do I manage interactive components? Um, Interactive components are great. If you're not familiar with them, it's when you're prototyping something and you have a component that you want to kind of always do the same thing whenever it appears in a prototype, like a button, you always want to show a hover state and a press state. What you would do is within your button set of components, so all your variants, you would apply the interactive settings at that level. So, default state always goes to hover, hover always goes to press, and it kind of loops back after a delay. So it's quite easy. Once you set it up, there really isn't too much more maintenance to do.
Okay, okay. And then finally, the one that got a lot of attention and then being brought up, my attention is being brought up to that one. How can we link the color hierarchy to a token structure? I guess
I don't see.
it's
So
the one.
linking the colors to your tokens.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is a great question. So I think because Figma doesn't support tokens natively, I think right now it still makes sense to save your styles using just the base name. So like primary 700, for example, instead of button background. And I think those tokens should be documented somewhere to match them up. And then in code, have those much more specific semantic tokens. However, I can't help myself, and I do use some semantic tokens in the UI prep design system, only for text and icon, because they're just so important that even though they match up with some of my neutral colors, I do pull them out to be a little more semantic, and they're just called text, primary, secondary, disabled. So there are, if you really do want to fuse semantic tokens, it's going to make a big difference to your designs. That's a good way to go about
Okay. Well, I mean, we could go like this forever, but I think we
it.
also have a bit of time by the end if you have a time to join us, Molly, for a quick panel
Of
after the
course,
last
yeah.
talk. Excellent. But so far, this has been incredible, and I think we learned all a lot about Figma and maybe all the things we don't know about Figma that we should know. So thank you so much. Maybe just before we wrap up here,
Mhm.
maybe I don't know. I heard a rumor that maybe this design system that you are showing, it's kind of the one that you've been working on. Maybe that somebody could get their hands on one day.
It's possible. I've heard rumors that if someone were to win something, they might win a free team license to the design system.
Oh,
That's
this
just a
is
little rumor
incredible.
I've heard.
Okay, do you want to share more insights about this rumor?
Sure, yeah. So the UI prep design system is the system I was just walking through as some examples. You can see all those the associated styles, all the same components, the whole thing. If you win the competition later, or as one of the winners, you'll win a free team license to that file. So you can download that file and use it with unlimited editors for unlimited projects, and it's yours to keep.
Excellent. You could also buy it later if you don't win
You
it, I
can
think.
also buy it later.
Yeah, I'm just
If
saying.
you
So it's
don't
not like
win,
it's
as
limited to
a
winning. Yeah,
if you don't
but yeah,
win, you can also buy it. Or if you want to learn how to do those things I just talked about, I also have my course, Design System Bootcamp.
exactly. Well, that's kind of what I try to nudge towards. Which I can only strongly recommend. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Moni. Everybody, please give a warm round of again puzzle emoji at this point to wrap it up. I guess that's only fair. And thank you so much for being with us, Moni.
Perfect. Thank you so much.